Every once in a while, a destructive and coercive cult is led by a duo rather than just a single figurehead. Now, I still think that Chad Daybell held the primary reins in his Church of the Firstborn, but his new wife, Lori Vallow Daybell, contributed fuel to that fire. Let's examine who was truly in charge in Chad Daybell's Doomsday Cult. Hey, thanks so much for joining Profiling Evil for this video. I hope that you'll take a moment and subscribe, hit that like button, make sure you're getting all of our notifications. Now, if you're like me, you've been watching the case of Chad Daybell in Idaho with great interest. When we think about religious cults, cults by their very nature often diverge from mainstream religious practices and beliefs, sometimes developing doctrines that justify their extreme behavior, including, in this case, murder. These cult leaders in these groups manipulate theological principles, psychological mechanisms, and sociocultural contexts to legitimize violence and control over their followers and people who end up being their targets. Now, this video is going to explore some of the methodologies and rationales that I believe Chad and Lori Daybell employed to justify murder. So I hope to share some thoughts on the psychological manipulation techniques that I've seen and the sociocultural factors that enable such bizarre justification. And justifying murder is just out of this world. Now, in my opinion, this all got its start when these two religious zealots who were operating independently but through like-minded ideologies somehow found themselves on a collision course in the form of a doomsday end-of-world conference, a room that was filled with other zealots with similar kinds of interests. Chad Daybell was a nominally known author of topics like apocalyptic conclusions to humanity, or as he would promote, his special gift of speaking to dead people, either through inspiration or through these portals that he's kind of conjured up in his mind. Now, on the other end, Lori Vallow was a doomsday prepper who I think was easily impressed at this doomsday conference with a guy named Chad Daybell. It was like pouring gasoline over an open flame. And these two were immediately embroiled in passion, not only physical passion, but in their end-of-world beliefs. This wasn't much different than many other people who attended similar kinds of conferences, even this conference. But something intriguing happened. Daybell and Vallow decided that they had actually lived together as a married couple in a previous life, living among deity. So I guess my question becomes, is Chad Daybell teaching Lori Vallow about this end-of-world vision, or were they coming together? But either way, he was teaching about his visions and his connection to deceased people. And he shared with Lori Vallow his personal knowledge that she happened to be his wife in a previous life, and that together they would be going on to do great things, including ushering in a new world after an apocalyptic end to this one that we live in. Now, many cult leaders use these apocalyptic prophecies to justify criminal activity, including, in this case, murder. Lori Daybell and Chad Daybell came together, but Chad Daybell, like other religious cult leaders, proclaimed that the end of the world was near, and that drastic measures, which ultimately allegedly included the need to murder people, was necessary in order to cleanse the world and prepare it for their God's return. Now, their wacky ideology isn't much different than that of Somebody like convicted murderer Charles Manson, who convinced his followers that a race war, helter-skelter, was imminent and that they needed to commit to murdering people in order to help this war emerge and they would become leaders of this new world order. Instead of predicting a race war, Chad and Lori Daybell started receiving revelation that made it possible to justify the most grievous of sins, the sin of murder, not only from a heavenly perspective, but against man's laws, murder. Testimony in the Chad Daybell trial is confirming that Daybell presented himself as a prophet or a divine being that had direct communication with this higher power, his God. And I'm going to let you define what his God is. Personally, it's not the same God I believe in, and I suspect it's not the same God that you believe in. Now, many of these homicidal cult leaders claim that their violent directives are really not their own. They're just fulfilling commandments they're receiving from this God that they believe in. I mean, think about people like David Koresh of the Branch Davidians. Here's a guy who portrayed his orders as direct instruction from the God he believed in, making his followers believe that their violent actions were actually divinely sanctioned events. Can you imagine the mindset that must go on and the grooming that has to occur before some seemingly intelligent person would look at the crime of murder and think, yeah, that makes sense to me? Well, speaking of Koresh, I want to just say that Chad Daybell appeared much more subtle. I mean, he was creating zombies or dark spirits, and then he was empowering people like Lori Vallow's brother Alex Cox to be his destroying angel, the one who exorcised these demons, ultimately allowing these people to die naturally. I'm still trying to figure out how killing J.J. Vallow, that cute little boy, or Tylee Ryan, or Tammy Daybell, how killing them so violently could be considered natural in their wacky way of thinking. In fact, I think that Alex was likely murdered as well. And I think that the investigators and the medical examiners couldn't put a case together back then. But I don't know, I'm only speculating based on what I've seen online. But I wouldn't be surprised if things change. I suspect they might change like they did in Charles Vallow's case. Something that was ruled as a self-defense homicide at first, and now changed to murder as we see Lori standing trial now for the murder of her husband. Cult leaders use these intensive indoctrination and brainwashing techniques to break individuals down, to break them into believing these new beliefs and instilling that the belief system they have justifies violence. Now, while Daybell's church didn't necessarily isolate its followers from everyday life, it emotionally isolated them from their families. Chad and Lori Daybell, the trials that we're watching are filled with examples where cult members distance themselves voluntarily from family members, from former spouses, from close friends. They were distancing themselves from anyone that didn't align with these new teachings that they were now embracing around Lori and Chad Daybell. And through this emotional and mental isolation, repetitive messages and the creation of an us versus them mentality has grown. Chad and Lori's power and influence was increasing amongst the members, and we hear testimony of how that was happening. And as this level of influence increases, several people testified in those two trials, the one ongoing and the previous, that they began participating in these seance-like castings, where cult members would perform vicarious exorcisms on people like Charles Vallow, reportedly earmarked as dark and evil. Now, like other cult leaders, Chad and Lori Daybell appeared to have successfully dehumanized people that they didn't like. People like Charles Vallow, or Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan, or J.J. Vallow. They dehumanized them through the assignment of these evil rankings, the dark rankings. And they demonized them and dehumanized them with names that they determined were evil spirits, like Ned. Now, reports suggest that Chad even went as far as saying that when these evil spirits would overtake a body, the real person, and the reference was made of Tammy in this instance, would sit in limbo awaiting death. They couldn't die until that body was destroyed. Daybell reportedly boasted that he would visit with people like Tammy in this limbo state and listen as they pled for someone great and powerful to exorcise the demon out of their occupied body so that it could die and they could go on to heaven and do whatever they were supposed to do next. This is how he justified this process and made it possible for people to look within his circle at these people as demons and dehumanized human beings. In fact, in the many text messages between Chad and Lori Daybell, it becomes increasingly clear that they were both in this thing together. There wasn't one necessarily causing the other to do things. Now, they did influence each other, and they were feeding off of each other. They were exploiting each other so that they could get the things that they particularly wanted. It may have been that Chad Daybell only wanted a torrid affair with Lori Vallow, and he wanted her to somehow believe all his ramblings about his spiritual prowess. On the other hand, Lori may have in the beginning really only wanted to have some additional power and control. She may have figured out that life insurance and Social Security is a pretty good source of income if you can only get rid of the liability attached to those, like a husband or children that had expenses. Now, I spoke about this briefly on Court TV last night, and I wanted to share just some of the thoughts I had in that regard. So let's take a moment and listen to that.
Religious cult expert, retired police commander, host of the Profiling Evil podcast, and author of the book Deceived, Mike King is with us. You know, we've been covering this for so long, right? And right there, it seems in that text exchange is where I see Chad absolutely involved in the planning and plotting, or is it more manipulation? What's your take on that exchange involving, you know, the ultimate death/murders of these two children?
You know, from day one, we were wondering who's in charge, and I think they're both in charge in different little parallel universes. I think that Lori is using the things that she's pretty good at, the manipulative skills that she's good at, to keep him in line. He's using his prowess as a religious leader to keep reminding her that, hey, I'm something special, where maybe he doesn't feel like he's that special overall. And together, they're feeding off of each other like two junior high kids. And it's just crazy to watch this thing unfold. Because when he starts getting a little edgy, Vinny, she steps up and love bombs him a little more and lets him know how much he's desired and needed and wanted. And then when she's starting to get a little questioning, he's saying, hey, I just talked to God and God told me this is going on and you're on the right track, Lori. And together, this is absolutely fuel and flame. And these two together have created this little world that only they live in, and everyone else is just kind of satisfying fantasy. I think Adam said a great thing there, because it's fantasy where all these things are created. It has to be created up here first before you can create it here. And these two together are getting that fantasy going, and then pretty soon the fantasy's not cool enough and you gotta act it out. You know, I also want to point out that together, Chad and Lori Daybell appear to have become homicidal. As I brought up this theory again, stating that those two were in this thing together. I mean, Lori Vallow Daybell is now a convicted killer. And I think the state has introduced a really compelling case that Chad Daybell was completely in the thick of this fantasy. He was completely in the planning and the execution of J.J. Vallow, Tylee Ryan, and Tammy Daybell. Let's watch this clip.
So who had the power, like behind closed doors in this relationship? Who's the mastermind? Let's bring back in our guests, Adam Cox, Sharonda Brown, Mike King. Mike, I'll start with you.
I think it is a dual ownership on this one. And often in these cults, Vinny, you see one leader, sometimes charismatic, but really one person that everybody points to that makes all the decisions. But I think once these two got together, they started really working as a team in getting other people who followed them to believe in some of these concepts. But when it comes to the two of them, Vinny, I really think the state's done a great job of pointing to Chad as the one that was coming up with all the religious doctrine, that was giving all the justification. Because most people are going to say, hey, I don't think killing somebody's right. But boy, you introduce God into this and say, hey, God is telling me I got to do this. Then people will step up and do things that they might never do in another circumstance. You know, fear is a powerful tool used by cult leaders to maintain control as they try to justify their extreme actions and directives. And as they create this sense of impending doom or existential threat, followers start looking to them for instruction and protection or survival. Again, think about Charles Manson, the Manson family. In that case, their murderous acts were partly justified through a fabricated fear of coming into this race war, which Manson claimed they would ultimately survive. So, knowing that they were special and they were going to survive, they went forward. Now, as Chad and Lori isolated their followers from the outside world, they created an echo chamber where only Chad and Lori's views begun to be heard by the group. And they were reinforced, making it difficult for members to seek alternative perspectives or to even question things like the justification for violence. Now, I don't necessarily find Chad Daybell to be particularly charismatic, but he did seem to wield a lot of power and control over his followers. And with the added manipulative prowess that Lori Vallow brought to the stage, I believe they were able to redefine morality for themselves and, of course, their followers, including the justification of murder with Alex Cox.
Adam, I want you to take a listen to your nephew, Colby Ryan, and his take on this issue.
Do you believe your mother was influenced by Chad Daybell?
Objection, Judge.
Grounds?
It's speculation. There's no foundation to base what he's basing this on.
It's a question of belief. It's overruled.
100%. I think she could be influenced. Yes.
Adam, what do you think?
Oh, well, if you go back with Chad, Lori's not the first woman that he approached and said that he was married to and all these probations. And I think there was other women that he mentioned, like, well, to be part of this thing, there's no kids involved. And I thought I heard one woman say that when she heard that, she was out. So obviously Chad had something going on with, coming up with this line to women. And unfortunately, Lori was in a position where she thought that he was special and he was the guy from God, and she was doing her part, because she wanted to be something special with religion and be in favor of God. All those things went through her head at some point. Obviously, she turned and went off the wall with him. But yeah, obviously, he had a huge impact on all this, the way it went down.
Mike, I want you to take a listen to Chad's mom talking about her son.
He's not gregarious. Do you understand what the word gregarious means?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
He's not a gregarious personality, is he?
No.
He met Tammy at a relatively young age,
Yes.
and they got married very young.
Yes.
Your son Chad is not necessarily a man of the world, right?
Not worldly.
So he didn't have like a lot of experience in dealing with relationships or anything like that, correct?
No.
In fact, Tammy was really his only ever real serious relationship,
Yes.
and that's the woman he married.
Yes.
Now, if we fast forward to Lori Vallow, she was a different personality, a much more dynamic personality, correct?
Yes.
Let me ask you, Mike, when it comes to this, this romantic side of this relationship, Lori comes with a lot more experience. I mean, she'd been married several times before. Do you think she held any power over Chad, at least on that aspect of the relationship?
I think absolutely, Vinny. I think he had his heart Twitter patterned, and he was overwhelmed with the fact that someone who he perceived to be beautiful and really something was paying attention to him and telling him how great he was and feeding into his own belief system that he was some celestial being that was going to be able to do things. She was giving him what he wasn't getting anywhere else, which is common sense. And that thing really bothers me when you think about her history and the fact that, she was learning some lessons along the way, whether she intended to learn those or planned on those. She learned with Joe Ryan that there was a money stream attached to his death. She learned with Charles Vallow that there should have been a money stream attached to his death, but thankfully that guy was smart enough to give Kay access and responsibility over that money. So that when you start pushing toward Tammy Daybell, and you see that there was a money train and an increase in life insurance and an immediate request just days after, the first business day after her death, I think there was a lot of education going both ways. But I think this guy was overwhelmed by the attention he was getting, and she knew it, and she was able to control him in that way. But he gave her something that she wasn't getting anywhere else. He somehow impressed upon her that he was in tune with God, and he could give her a one-way ticket up to heaven and to all kinds of power and control. I also think it's important to point out that most individuals who join cults are often in a really vulnerable position with their beliefs, their own level of security, maybe their socioeconomic or psychological standing. Cult leaders are pros at exploiting these vulnerabilities, and they offer solutions that might be criminal, but they're acceptable to the members because it's been justified within the cult's belief system. So I want to focus my thoughts for a minute in two areas that I think are really interesting in this case. First, I want to focus on the way in which Chad Daybell would twist religious doctrine and somehow convince his followers that he was a prophet of sorts, evidenced by his doomsday revelations. I think somebody like Lori Vallow, and I think Lori Vallow in particular, was sucked into this hook, line, and sinker. She believed that he somehow was connected to deity. In fact, I believe it's one of the only ways that I can justify in my own mind that she would have been attracted to this guy. Because, I'm just really having a difficult time figuring out why these two connected if it wasn't something much beyond the normal way that people come together originally. Now, religious cult leaders like Chad Daybell appear to maintain control over their followers through these apocalyptic prophecies. They leverage the fear and the hopes that people have. They are professional psychological manipulators, and they excel in a couple of primary areas that I want to just point out real quickly. For instance, Chad and Lori Daybell appear to have created a fear of impending doom. Now, Daybell and Lori Vallow and their followers believed, or they at least espoused, that an apocalyptic event was coming. It was imminent. They created this sense of urgency, and they created a sense of fear. And this fear of the impending disasters made the followers more reliant upon them for protection and for guidance. This constant reminder of an approaching apocalypse kept the cult members in a heightened state of anxiety, and they made it possible to because of this anxiety, make their followers more pliable and obedient to their wacky notions. The next thing is that Chad and Lori Daybell appear to have created an us versus them mentality. You see, by predicting these apocalyptic scenarios and other problems, Chad and Lori Daybell could create a strong in-group versus out-of-group dynamic. So in these kinds of cases, the followers are told that they are the chosen ones. They are the ones that are going to be saved, while all the outsiders, which is you and me, would be doomed. Now, this dichotomy strengthens the group's cohesiveness and their loyalty to the leaders. They become followers of a really exclusive group of people, and that group has a really critical mission on Earth. I believe Chad and Lori Daybell offered hope and salvation to their followers. They promised their followers that Chad and ultimately their combined teachings and commands would ensure that those who followed them survived this apocalyptic moment, and that they were granted salvation after the impending apocalypse and into the eternities. Now, this promise of safety and better future motivated their followers to comply with their demands, no matter how extreme they became. Now, I believe that Chad and Lori Daybell appear to have promised a reward system, so to speak. There has been testimony that's come out that's led me to theorize that the Doomsday Couple introduced kind of a system of rewards and punishments tied to the prophesied apocalypse. And those followers who remained obedient and faithful were promised special roles and rewards in this new post-apocalyptic world order that was going to happen, while people that dissented faced dire consequences. This system was reinforcing loyalty, and it was discouraging the question of any of the leadership authority. And that's really important, because this is a key moment for cults, when people quit questioning because of the love bombing or the idea that they might win in the end. Chad and Lori Daybell, in my opinion, appear to have manipulated, indoctrinated, and brainwashed their followers into believing this bizarre apocalyptic belief system. Through their repetitive teachings, through isolation from outside influences, and control over their information that they were receiving, the followers came to accept Chad and Lori Daybell's prophecies as an absolute truth. This deep-seated belief then made it more likely that they would follow orders without question. Tying all this together, it appears that Chad and Lori Daybell successfully altered their followers' perceptions of reality. By constantly discussing the apocalypse and other problems, they were able to alter their followers' perceptions of reality. Now, normal societal rules and ethics can be suspended in the face of an existential threat. And that's what they convinced them of. It allowed Chad and Lori to justify extreme behaviors and their extreme demands. And the followers were led to believe that their actions, no matter how drastic, were necessary for the greater good. And when they came to that realization, then violating criminal law was much easier. And I also think that Chad and Lori Daybell appear to have gained control over their followers, evident by the way in which they manipulated people like Alex Cox and others who actually testified in this court hearing. Leaders often physically and socially isolate followers from the outside world, and this isolation prevents exposure to contradictory kinds of information. It reinforces the leader's vision. Again, Chad and Lori's vision of this apocalypse that was coming. In these closed environments, the leaders, like the Daybells, their teachings become the primary source of truth and guidance. And as these leaders gain more control over their followers, they begin exercising control over all parts of their daily life, including things like what they're going to eat, where they're going to live, and who they're going to socialize with, or even who they're going to marry. This control ultimately extends to monitoring and limiting communication with outsiders. And those kinds of things are the things that ensure that the leaders have followers who will remain within their psychological and physical control. You know, Chad and Lori Daybell appear to have, and this is my opinion, but they appear to have exploited their followers' vulnerabilities. Cult leaders across the board prey on individuals who are experiencing personal crises, maybe experiencing financial trouble, or relationship issues, or they have doubts about theology. You know, they offer this sense of purpose and they offer a sense of belonging framed within the context of their prophecies. This emotional manipulation actually creates a dependency on the leaders. And I believe that these followers of Chad and Lori Daybell actually had a dependency on those two. They looked at them for psychological and emotional support. Can you imagine looking to these two for psychological or emotional support? You know, it seems to me that Chad and Lori Daybell induced paranoia by suggesting that all these external forces were working against the group, reinforcing the urgency and the legitimacy of their prophecies. And this paranoia makes followers more defensive. It makes them less likely to question the leader's motives or their actions. And in this particular case, it actually helped the Daybells for a while in thwarting the investigation, as the followers were, at least in the beginning, less enthused about helping police who were looking for two missing kids. In short, it seems to me that Chad Daybell maintained control over Lori Vallow, and ultimately they maintained control over their followers through these apocalyptic prophecies and through instilling fear, offering hope, and manipulating their perceptions and their emotions. And through this combination of indoctrination, isolation, and emotional exploitation, Chad Daybell created an environment where his followers, starting with Lori Daybell, felt compelled to adhere to his teachings and his commands, leading to what ultimately would be extreme and dangerous behavior. But Lori, on the other hand, while she was involved in her own pursuit of a spiritual elitism, used her ability to manipulate Chad and others through her charisma, through physical rewards, and even through threats that we see coming out. She used charm and sexual manipulation to convince Chad, and I believe Alex, to commit murder through a combination of emotional and psychological tactics. So in the case of Chad Daybell, I want you to think about Lori's tactics that I believe included things like charm and seduction. You see, Lori, in Chad's eyes and in his psyche, possessed this superficial charm that was really persuasive to him. She used her charisma to build a strong, seemingly genuine connection with him. And then she upped the ante with sexual manipulation. Now, this created a bond through physical intimacy that resulted in Chad feeling a deep romantic or sexual attraction to Lori Daybell. He needed her at times, wanted her, fantasized about her. I mean, all these wacky things. Now, she exploited Chad's vulnerabilities by identifying emotional and psychological weaknesses that he had, such as maybe low self-esteem or his desire for validation. And in so doing, she made him feel dependent upon her for emotional fulfillment and validation. She created a false narrative of being a victim, somebody who's facing grave injustices in her life. And this feeling may have elicited Chad's protective instincts. You know, above all, once they hooked up, she created an us versus them mentality that convinced Chad Daybell that they were in this special, unique relationship that justified real extreme actions. All the while, he's being manipulated into believing that they have been married before and that this is just a continuation of their greatness and glory. Now, in my opinion, Lori gradually escalated her demands, and this, I think, is evidenced by her playing him in these text messages, suggesting things like he didn't want her bad enough to get rid of Tammy and be with her in Hawaii. You know, she said things like, go be a father and a husband and just don't worry about me. I'll move on. Now, initially, she began asking for small favors that slowly increased in severity, leading up to the ultimate act of murder. You see, by normalizing unethical and illegal behaviors over time, she may have desensitized Chad to the idea of committing these more serious crimes like murder. But I believe he had to come up with revelations with his God to make all this right. I really think that his behavior and their effort to conceal these murders proves that he understood the difference between right and wrong. They knew what society standards were, and yet they went out and committed murder anyway. You know, whenever Chad Daybell expressed concerns to Lori, or he drug his feet, so to speak, Lori would isolate him from her further love and attention. I suspect even including intimacy. And this isolation included emotional separation, where he began to feel that only she truly understood or cared for him. And thus, Lori Vallow, who later became Lori Daybell, was playing Chad Daybell like a fiddle as she made promise after promise about their future together. But only a future that would occur after the obstacles of the children and Tammy Daybell were out of the way. Now, well, as we wrapped up what would prove to be an hour of discussion time on Court TV last night, I left a couple of parting comments about this cult and the people involved in it.
Now, Mike King, I know you spent a lot of your professional years looking at and examining cults and the mentality and everything that goes into it. This won't be the first, it won't be the last, but what's your real takeaway from the followers of Chad Daybell?
I think they had like-minded ideologies, Vinny. I think they were looking for something more than anyone else had. They wanted to have more light and knowledge. They wanted to have a closer connection with whatever God it is that they believed in. They want to have more power and control. And they want to have this sense that they are somehow a little bit higher elevation or a little bit more elevated than the people around them. And I'll tell you, you hear these people coming up with all these wild ideas, like they're having visions and they're talking to spirits. And it takes me back to the kids in the Zion Society when they used to get stuck in a room and they were told you can't come out until you've connected with somebody on the other side, your guardian angel, who's given you some form of advice. And they later in their years would say, well, we were making up stuff just to get over it. But what was happening is something really critical. They were starting to conform, or the separation. The love bombing was more important. Being pulled into the group and being one was a whole lot more important than saying, hey, this doesn't sound right, and all of this is not making sense to me. So unless you become more spiritual, you're going to be left out, and nobody wants to be left out.
No one, yeah, exactly. You want to be part of this group, and it becomes so dangerous. It became so dangerous, and in this case, it became deadly for those around Chad and Lori. But to me, it's about, the obstacles. Like, Chad wanted to be with Lori wanted to be with Chad, everything else fall by the wayside.
Well, I think Vinny was absolutely right. As different as each of these cults like to think they are, they're very much the same. So whether you're talking about Charles Manson's manipulation of his end-of-world prophecies and the racial tension that justified the Tate LaBianca murders, or you're talking about Jim Jones and his fear, isolation, and charismatic authority that actually culminates in the murder massacre of over 900 followers, groups like these, and in my opinion, groups like Lori and Chad Daybell's Church of the Firstborn, are just one wacky leader away from murder. And this case is proving how quickly that can happen. And just like in this case, I believe that religious cult leaders justify murder through a combination of theological manipulation, psychological control, and exploitation of a sociocultural vulnerability. Now, this is not about mainstream religions. These are wackos that take what's learned in mainstream religion and pervert it for their own desires and needs. They present themselves as divinely guided while dehumanizing outsiders and creating an environment of fear and isolation that actually convinces their followers to obey their commands, even when the commands are to murder children. Well, if you'd like to learn more about destructive cults and how these terrifying leaders recruit people and keep them subservient within their cults, check out my book, Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult. Deceived chronicles my investigation and ultimate takedown of a destructive cult that was sexually abusing children and adults. You can order it by clicking on the link that's in the description below, or you can go over to profilingevil.com and order it there. But make sure you don't order the signed copy, because I'm going to be signing them for free for a limited time. So please consider picking up Deceived. And just so you know, the proceeds from this book are going to build a children's advocacy center, a place where children who are victimized can be physically and forensically examined and prepared for the court system. It's our belief that those kids will walk in pretty broken, but hopefully go out the back door a whole lot healthier. And you're helping when you pick up Deceived. Now, understanding the methods that cult leaders use to recruit and run cults is crucial for recognizing and preventing this formation and escalation of such dangerous groups in the future. I'd really like to know your thoughts on what I've shared today, and I hope you'll put them in the boxes down below in the chat. Please spend some time reading over other people's comments and join in on the conversation with them, but please remember to be kind in your responses. Hey, please watch for Profiling Evil on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you like audio podcasts, folks, please go sign up for Profiling Evil podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. Hey, and thanks for supporting Profiling Evil. If you're going to be at CrimeCon, I hope you'll come over and say hello, and I'll look forward to seeing you in Nashville, Tennessee in a couple of weeks. Hey, we'll see you soon. at the next crime scene.